Stephen Trout has a big job. He's responsible for ensuring the uniform interpretation and application of Oregon's election laws. He oversees voter registration, state initiatives, referendums, candidate processes, campaign finance reporting, and the production and distribution of the state's voters pamphlet, which is distributed to approximately 1.7 million households for each primary and general election. I read a poll earlier this year, clearly not talking about you, Oregon, but it said 43% of the public don't think election administrators are doing anything to secure our elections. This seems like a significant challenge you face in doing your job. What do you do to assuage these sorts of concerns?
I think that's probably the biggest challenge. I'm not a media communications person. I'm just trying to administer the elections. And I think we need to do a better job of communicating the things that we're doing. Compared to 4 years ago, we are light years ahead of where we were there. I mean, I have conversations at least once a week, if not 2 or 3 times a week, with the Department of Homeland Security, with the FBI. Earlier this year, back in January, I think in a 2-week period, I had 4 briefing calls and 3 classified briefing calls with all of them, just talking about different threats and all of that. Some of that discussion has been lost with COVID, but the threats are still real. But I think to the question, the challenge is getting people to understand what we do. And I'm not having any success at getting free media because it's not sensational or sexy information to say all of the firewalls and the protocols that we're putting in place to protect an election, to protect our technology. And so I think that's the biggest piece of the challenge. If we did get into the nuts and bolts of what we're doing, most people wouldn't understand that. And so I think that's really a big piece of the challenge of people understanding what we're doing. I can assure you that all of my peers throughout the country are working tirelessly on security, and it's pretty much dominated most of what we've done the last 3 years. That being said, if we can't get the public to understand what we're doing, they're not going to have as much confidence.
I agree. There's some element of PR, right, that needs to happen around this. And I don't know, your job sounds pretty cool. You're having some pretty cool phone calls there. So we, follow as investors in startups, Microsoft a lot. They have this design philosophy around gaming where they call it design for one, apply to all. And they start with gamers who have limited mobility, for example. And if we're serious about access, how are we thinking about the needs of specific individuals that are maybe unable to use mail-in ballots?
Right. And I think that's an important piece of this, and something that we've spent years trying to figure out how best, number one, to identify those people that would have accessibility needs or that aren't able to interact well with a printed mail ballot. And so that led us almost a decade ago now, as I was talking to those that use assistive devices, National Federation for the Blind, different advocacy groups, saying, how do you interact with the government or with businesses in everyday life? Whether that's banking or grocery shopping or digital book from the library, what it has it. And so we kind of worked with them to say, okay, the tools you're using today, let's figure out a way to get you a ballot through that. And so that's what led us to be able to start utilizing tablets here for those people that have a desire to use those tablets for accessibility purposes. It can read the audio ballot. You can make it bigger, the text bigger. You can plug in assistive devices, jelly bean paddles, sip and puff, whatever, to be able to navigate that ballot. And so, that's what we've really tried to focus on. And then kind of the efficiency, kind of the Microsoft model that you're talking about, we didn't want to have 5 different systems. And so what we've been able to do is kind of combine the accessible tool with our military and overseas tool so that it's just one option. And so you can, if you're a military voter, you can go on to our website, or the county can email you the ballot. You can mark it with the screen reader and information that's there in our system and return it. We can't just kind of go with one size fits all. I mean, that's what I've really learned in elections over the last 25 years is there is no one size fits all. We've got a bunch of different customers that we have to meet them where they are.
Meet them where they are. I like that. I'd love to ask you to repeat some of the comments you made as recently as last week about the logistical hurdles that you face when delivering a secure vote in 2020.
lots of people looking at vote by mail, and we've learned lessons over the last 20, 30 years as we've done this. A lot of people just aren't anticipating. Um, how are you going to get the ballots printed? Some voting systems require particular paper and have to order that months in advance. I was on a call last Friday with a couple of the large ballot printers, and they scale their business to the November of a presidential year. They're not going to have more capacity just laying around. And so they're already at maximum capacity for November today. And so in order for them to add capacity, they're going to have to go overseas and buy new printing machines that are pretty big investments. And so that's a lot of their questions. Is this going to be permanent, or is this just a one-time deal? And so, that's one of the things that's driving that narrative. They're really customized. The envelopes that we send out, and we do through different testing to make sure that voters can interact with them well in the language, and that they're usable, and that they go through the sorters and the automatic openers, those counties that have those. And so there's a lot of pieces to making this happen. You can't just flip a switch and say, poof, everybody's vote by mail. You got to focus on the voters and educate the voters if you're going to make this kind of a switch. I remember, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when HAVA first came in, and there was transitioning from punch cards to optical scan ballots. And for the first couple of elections, we had a bunch of ballots that came in where people, instead of filling in the oval, punched a hole in the oval because that's what they knew and that's what they'd always done. And so I think we have to remember that we're dealing with voters, and this isn't their life. They're not spending a lot of time focusing on this. And so any changes, especially in a major presidential year, are going to take a lot of voter education.
What can the private sector do to help? What are the gaps that you think need to be filled?
Well, I think, again, focusing on where the voters are, what they want. I think there was a Harvard-Harris poll last week that said 57% of people were happy to vote on the internet. If you listen to the narrative out there with different policymakers and some of the advocacy groups, they're saying we should never move there. And so I think, kind of like vote by mail, it's not something that you want to flip the switch and move to overnight, but I think we want to try to meet the voters where they are and start to look into different tools that we could allow them. And, there's a lot of security, a lot of technology out there. There's challenges, I'm sure, but if we don't start working on it and start doing pilots and start testing things and having, cooperation with a lot of smart technical minds, we're not going to get there. But I think we can get there. The public wants us to get there. And what we don't want to do is have a crisis like we've got this year with the pandemic, driving policy changes and people jumping to vote by mail when they haven't really thought about it or implemented a lot of policies. If we had mobile voting today and would have started, working on this and testing it in pilots 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we'd be further along and might be close to having a product that we could roll out and the public could have confidence in. But I think, as far as your question with respect to what can the technology industry do, I think a lot of it is having something that's easy for the public to understand, because the public's got to have confidence that this system, whatever it is secure and safe, and that their vote is going to be accurately counted. And so that's the challenge with all the noise out there, and whether it's driven by, partisan politics or technology concerns or experience or security. Those are all challenges that we're going to have to navigate. And, as an election administrator, I'm a risk manager. With the budget I'm given, there's no way that I can pull off a Fort Knox election. There's always going to be some risk, and so I have to figure out the best ways to mitigate it, and which ones I'm going to be able to accept, where I've got some mitigation strategies to be able to overcome them if something were to go wrong. Having something technology-wise that people can understand, that they're familiar with, that they'll have confidence in, I think is probably the way that we're going to move to accept more technology in the voting arena. I mean, if you look back 20 years ago, there was hardly any, and now we've got electronic poll books and tablets and email ballots coming back in some states, and so it takes time, and we need our technology partners to help to come up and test some of these ideas, and unfortunately, it's not something that anybody's probably going to get rich on, because there's not a lot of election jurisdictions out there that are going to buy these things, and our budgets are small. But we've had different tools that come in. Usually, it's something that's been used in some other area that if we can kind of morph that in and find some election application, that's probably a great way to have technology become more involved in elections.
Makes sense. I mean, a lot of this is marketing too, right? I mean, rather than talking about the latest, greatest artificial intelligent machine learning, blockchain-y thing, we can talk about, bank level security and things like that people understand. So great point.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the big part of this. I mean, you and I can have a conversation on the technology and be 100% confident in it. But if we can't explain that to the public, that's a challenge. I mean, I think, there's been a lot of discussion here the last couple of years about risk limiting audits. But nobody can really explain what those are. And so when I go out and talk to the voters, they actually have less confidence when you explain to them an audit because, well, if you're having to audit the election, something must have gone wrong. And I mean, that was surprising to me, but I'm glad I went out and asked the voters. And so, you can put together, some complex tools out there and solutions, but if the public doesn't understand and isn't willing to accept it, it's not really going to help build that public confidence that we need to endure.
I think you've mentioned in the past that misinformation is still the biggest concern here in 2020. So what kinds of narratives are you actually most concerned about when it comes to voting itself?
I think, and part of this, honestly, I think dates back to a lot of the civic education that just isn't happening in the latest generations that was a couple generations ago. And so people really don't understand the process. I know the Secretary of State office is on the ballot here in Oregon this year, and a lot of people in the public just don't even know what that means or what the secretary does. And so, that's part of the challenge that I'm up against in explaining what we do. And there's still people out there that think that election administrators work 2 days every 2 years. And so, trying to explain what we do, educate them. And so, I just think the scary part, as we continue to move forward, is more and more people using election administration for partisan political gain and kind of sensationalizing things, and that's happening on both sides of the aisle. And we need to try to avoid that. All that's doing is reducing public confidence.
There's a divide, it seems like, between voters, policymakers, senators, who believe that the technology that is internet connected, like voter registration, application, issuing mail-in ballots, is fine. But somehow, once that technology is on a mobile phone, it's suddenly risky and dangerous. What am I missing in this argument?
I don't think you are missing anything. I think they're the ones that are missing the argument. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that's driven by partisan political thoughts. But yeah, I mean, we need to evaluate all of our systems and make sure that they're secure, make sure that they're accessible. But I think this absolutism out there is really driving a wedge. And our systems need to be secure. Yes, we need to be able to accept some risk that we can mitigate to allow military and overseas voters to return their ballots, those with accessibility needs to be able to return their ballots. There's got to be a balance here because, again, I've never seen a perfect election. I don't expect to see a perfect election in my lifetime. We're doing this the best that we can, and it's very, very good. It's better than it's ever been. But is it perfect? No. And so just because something might have a problem doesn't mean that we shouldn't try it. And if let's find out if there are problems, and let's test things and use the technology partners to make things better, because the public is going to continue to demand more instant information, instant access. We need to find them where they are, and so that's what I think election administrators need to be doing. At the same time, some of these voices are loud. Some of them are small groups that just have a good megaphone. Other groups aren't able to get their voices heard as much, and so there's always a balance out there. Especially, I think, when we talk about security and accessibility, and our military and overseas voters. We're going to have to accept some risk there, but at the same time, with accepting that risk, we need to have things in place to be able to detect if something goes wrong, and then to be able to correct it. those are the challenges as we look to the future. Is, you know, we can't sit here where we are today and expect, you know, even vote by mail to be the tool that we're going to be using 20 years from now. We've got to continue to develop and innovate and look at new ways to do things. We need to look at better ways to authenticate voters. I think that's the big thing coming in the next 10 years. We can't stay where we are today. We need to continue to get better and innovate and be able to better serve our voters where they want to be served.
Steve, thank you so much for all the effort you're putting in and leadership on this. It's pretty incredible.
Thank you.
And we do know that you work more than a couple days a year. So
yeah.
We're all pretty confident about that, especially now. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining.
Hey, my pleasure.